Yeah, hi Lynn. How's it going?
Hi, Keith. Nice to see you. And it's about 8:30 my time in California and 1 o'clock a.m. in West
Yeah.
Australia, you said.
Yeah, just interested in how you got started with the Edgar Cayce, or what attracted you to it, or how did you first, come in contact with the Cayce material or work?
Well, I was about 18, 19 years old, and but actually I had an earlier encounter at 12. I grew up, I was born in Berkeley, California. My father had just come back from his service as a young man in World War II. And he and my mother met at University of California in Berkeley. And we were living in my grandfather's house, and he took a job with the United States Geological Survey. And he remained there his whole working career, becoming the Western Regional Management Officer for the United States Geological Survey for the Western states. And we moved from Berkeley to Menlo Park, California, when I was about 4. And I wasn't surrounded by exposure to Casey work or spiritualism per se, but at age 12, I read the Bridie Murphy story about the hypnotist who, while inadvertently hypnotizing a woman for medical reasons, happened to stumble upon her past life in Ireland. And looking back on that, there were references to Cayce, which I wouldn't have understood completely, but somehow it made perfect sense to me. I had wonderful, much older grandparents at the very beginning of my life, and older people surrounding me because my grandparents had had their children late in life. And so I was the first grandchild when we lived in Berkeley, and it was a lovely time. My grandfather uh, was involved a little bit with music. And so, anyway, when we moved to Menlo Park, we moved down the peninsula, and we had on the surface kind of a Leave It to Beaver life. That was an era where there could be problems, but they were sort of swept under the cover because of the optimism after the war. And my mother, who came from Omaha, did expose me a lot to creativity, which I really appreciate, and creative freedom. So gradually the grandparents began to pass because they were so much older. And I think I was somewhat attuned to that. But when we were stationed in Washington, D.C., the Department of Interior wanted my father to advance and become the director in Washington, but he preferred us to live in California. So we would drive out and we would live there for periods of months in government housing and return. While there, I started having a lot of dreams about infinity, and I seemed to be traveling a bit out of my body amongst the planets. But again, these were just stirrings within me. And then later, as a young teenager, I gravitated back in California toward the beginning of the civil rights movement. I was interested in Quaker kids and the message of peace, and awakened to the injustice that was being done to people of color, even where we lived. And we lived in one of the most enlightened places. So I became involved in Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And because I was in gifted programs for language as a child. I was tall. I sort of appeared older than my age, so they made me a speaker to help raise money for civil rights uh, and for voter registration in the South. So I got involved in that, and one thing led to another, and soon I was caught up in the changing events that were occurring in Berkeley. I was making art posters with an older girlfriend who was in college then at the San Francisco Art Institute for peace marches and things like that. And those movements were idealistic to begin with. I think the introduction of the drug component was not a positive thing. And yet it did There were positive things such as Maharishi teaching meditation. So my mother she'd had a little more challenging upbringing, and she was being difficult for me as a teenager, which propelled me also to hang out with these older sort of young people. And I remember going to a Joan Baez, Mimi, and Dick Farina concert in Big Sur. I think I even hitchhiked down there, and that was things that could be done then. And then from then on to Venice. So I was having some adventures and misadventures with the young people of my time who went against the materialistic approach, the status approach, much like St. Francis and St. Clare of Assisi, who gave up a lot of worldly goods to live more simply, to help the poor. So it was the best of times and the worst of times. And it led to my learning to meditate when I was 17. I did manage to get in Berkeley early for a while, and at an early age, and I did learn to meditate with Maharishi. And gradually, my interests diverged. I almost married a fellow from who was at Stanford, and we went up to Idaho for a while. And I was 18 years old, newly in love, and I didn't understand some of the issues in his life that we would better understand today. He was close to his mother, sang opera, and he might have been he might have had a different orientation than I understood. And so when that relationship broke up, and returned to California, I really wanted to know why. And I began to, but I realized I had to accept that. And when I accepted the news that he had moved on, I think he married a lady much older, and he had interest in the same sex. And when that disappointment occurred, I opened some book, I think it was Mayor Baba, and it just said the word accept. So I accepted everything that happened in a profound way. And I had kind of a spiritual awakening for a few weeks where I was in a very peaceful and very different state of consciousness. And during that time, I was led to several things. I visited a Black church in East Palo Alto because I could feel the spirit and the music. I picked up a St. Francis statue at a garden store, perhaps hearkening to another life. And somebody exposed me to the work of Ruth Montgomery, I think, that mentioned Edgar Cayce. And gradually, when I read, that led me to, my mother had seen an intuitive in San Jose, about a half-hour drive from Menlo Park. I went to her and she suggested I go to a meeting that was occurring at a place called We and Our Neighbors Hall in San Jose. So I was 19 when I went there, and on the piano lay these booklets about Edgar Cayce, written by Jessica Madigan, whom I did not know. And they were on subjects like twin souls, karma, past lives, life after death. And I stood there that night and I read every one of them. I understood perfectly her allusions to Edgar Cayce, and suddenly everything that I'd gone through that was of a struggle, the rather harrowing times on the road in those experimental times, the conflicts with my mother, it all made sense. These were my own lessons returning to me. And a woman announced that her sister was going to have a class after the first of the year and how to discover your past lives. And so I went to classes with Marcia Hunter. And she was a bit older, a young housewife, and she did draw people around her seeking spiritual truth. She later brought me down to a Silmar where I met Jessica Madigan, a wise, kind woman who had herself been orphaned as a child, I learned much later. And her early challenges led her to seek spiritual truth, including finally coming home to the work of Edgar Cayce. And she had, in probably 1949 or so, no, 1944 Christmas, she had written a letter to Edgar Cayce asking for a reading. She was much like Cayce in that she saw auras, and as the envelope closed, a shadow came over it, and she knew somehow she would not receive the reading. He passed, as we know, in early 45, but a few years later, she did come to Virginia Beach, where his son, Hugh Lynn, recognized in her some of the sensitivity and gifts of his father. She loved the Cayce work and became an early speaker and organizer. And actually, one of her talks about karma is on this improved, transformed channel, along with her later works. So at Asilomar, I met Jessica, and they say that a moment of grace occurs when someone recognizes who you really are and your purpose. And she did. And so from that moment on, I felt, and I feel to this day, part of a purpose to help the Edgar Cayce work to expand in the world, and also in a very inclusive way. She brought a uniquely brilliant feminine perspective and heart perspective to the work. So from that point on, I was involved in youthful spiritual groups. I studied dream interpretation and meditation and many other Cayce-related topics. That group existed for a while. I eventually left it and went on with my life, but I began to teach for the Cambrian YWCA ESP evening, the work of Edgar Cayce. I later, after Jessica's death in the 80s, I had completed an undergraduate degree that had only started. That was the time we dropped in and dropped out in Berkeley, and I finished a degree at Antioch. I by then had my first marriage and 2 children, one of whom had special needs. And if I had not had the Edgar Cayce understanding, the challenge of that would have been even more heartbreaking. But I knew that this is one lifetime for Vanessa and for me, and there were definite lessons. At first, I was overwhelmed, young, selfish, scattered, but over time, I grew to put her needs first. And I would ask Jessica, who gave Akashic readings, non-monetized, especially to young people, when she would come up here, people would crowd around her, and she was always wanting to help the underdog. So there was a young man who had been paralyzed in a hunting accident, and he played music for her, and he'd have readings till all hours. But she said, "Darling, I think you can discover them for yourself." So she said, pray about it for about a year, sincerely, to understand your lessons and your talents. And gradually I had a series of past life dreams, which helped me know who I had been in the there and the then. Currently, I'm helping write songs, and I recently wrote a song about the long ago is here now, about that saga of past life discoveries. So it became a part of my life, not only through the early spiritual search groups and most importantly, Jessica's influence till her passing, but it just became a natural part of me from such an early age that it's second nature to me now. You know, as Barbra Streisand saying, it's second nature to me now. And it's brought comfort, insight, and I've been able to help others. Last year, for some reason, Who's Who of America, I did go on to write books, I should digress, including about that early experience. Before I get to Who's Who of America, I would say that after Jessica died, and I had just completed my undergraduate degree and started a graduate degree at John F. Kennedy University, I felt a restlessness there, even though the principles of psychology were very helpful to me. My original, my friend, the painter, who was older than I, whom I'd met at Experimental Pacific High, with whom I'd done the anti-war marching and so forth, had a mother, Muriel Schiffman, who had started through adult ed some communication workshops way back. And they helped me greatly to better understand my hidden emotions. So I had a little background in psychology, and I was able through Antioch to codify some of my studies in the community and other studies actually through Jessica and in the transpersonal. I learned that now academically, this was part of transpersonal psychology. So my undergraduate degree was transpersonal psychology. And now I was in a graduate program, but I was a little restless because it didn't include the spiritual dimension enough. And so I prayed and I said, if I belong anywhere else, please, I prayed I consider God, both my father and mother, God, to help me and direct me. And darn if about the next day in the mail, there came a notice that Atlantic University had been recently revived. It had closed during the problems with the Blumenthals and long ago in the late 20s. And I applied. And sure enough, not only did I get in, but right away through Greta Tedrick, a woman who had directed the Northern California ARE, I met a woman, a psychologist, Jeannie Holcomb. She had a place right by the beach for $100 a month, and she needed help watching her daughter when she was working. And there I was flying out to Virginia Beach, where I embarked in '89 on my graduate studies. It was an experience. It was more than just a graduate program. It was a body, mind, soul immersion where you would meet friends from other lives. They called it Karma City. I had awakened along the way of my studies to the absence of the feminine in certain areas of endeavor already. And for example, I had a creative writing mentor whom I met, the late Louise Vernon, who I met when I went back to San Jose State for a little while before completing all my degrees, and immersed myself in creative writing because Jessica had said in a reading, write, WRITE, write those things that have not been written. Comfort ye, my people, came the message. So I had awakened to the feminine. Well, how are you? How are you doing? What's going on with you during my little break? Tell me about what's going on with the channel and you and so forth. What's happening?
My personal life, I paused the Edgar Cayce work for a little while because I'm doing a study. I'm studying. It's called event management. It's an interesting subject.
Oh, event management.
Yeah, it's a diploma course. So I just started last week. So when it, and I'm 55, and most of the students in my class are like in their 20s. So I'm like the oldest student in the class, but so I'm like double their age.
Will this be to do online or in-person events?
Well, it's in person. Yeah, so it's a well written course. It's actually very interesting. So I've been studying it. So basically, try and manage events, but basically anything can be an event. Like weddings or any event is such a big thing now.
This is to kind of expand your career and earning power and so forth.
Yeah, well, because I'm 55 and I've been working in a factory, not a factory, a warehouse. I work at Woolworths, which is like a distribution center. Yeah. So you were talking about Atlantic University in 1989. So you just got there, you went there, and do you remember who were there at that time, and how you got started?
Well, the notice came in the mail that they were starting the college, and very quickly, a higher power had me there. Everything flowed to get there. My younger daughter was a teenager, traveled with me. And when we got to the airport, I had told her that Virginia, which is still part of the South, I talked about civil rights and how a long time ago Black people had been treated in the South. And she said, oh, my friends she's from California, they're different colors. We don't care. So when we got to the airport, there was one fellow who was looking down at the ground. She says, Mommy, how come he's not looking up? I said, well, they're remnants of what happened in the South, even though they had just elected their first Black maybe governor. And when we settled in Virginia Beach, we noticed that there were men on horseback, and some of the students from Black colleges, they would go down to the beach, but there was some degree of monitoring. Supposedly there'd been some incident the year before, but it was an interesting place to go. I had lived in Virginia because my dad had been stationed there a couple of times. And so anyway, I got to a place that was interesting to me culturally, quite different from California. And I got settled in this little place just a block from the ARE. And Megan went back, and graduate school started. And the graduate classes were small, and we were mainly, adults. We could be 30, some were older, their 40s and so forth. And we gathered around teachers like we had Henry Reed and Margaret, forgetting her last name, and Reverend Bob Danner. Interestingly, Cayce, the classes focused on transpersonal studies, not specifically Cayce, but we were immersed in the Cayce library. All the resources were there. And we studied, chakras and the energy system, principles of transpersonal psychology. My degree would be in psychology, philosophy, and religion. And Charles Thomas Cayce was there, of course, and
Was
the person who
Mark Thurston there as well? Mark Thurston?
Mark Thurston was involved in my courses, but I somehow became friends with Pam Bro, the daughter of Harmon Bro. We struck up a very deep friendship, and June Bro later. And so my daughter came out again and was welcomed by them, that family. So she became later a mentor in my graduate committee, and a very good friend. And it felt like finding soul sisters in the East that paralleled the West. Now, while I was there, the California earthquake struck, and there was the 89 earthquake, and there was no communication from California for a while. So it looked like the Golden Bridge had sunk. For all I knew, I was the only surviving member of my family at first, because there was no way to get through. I finally called a friend in Idaho who reached my older husband then, Joe, and I learned that they were all right. But it was a strange experience. I was interviewed by the local paper because I was from the Bay Area, and I was very much thrust in many ways into the community surrounding the ARE. Because of my teacher, Jessica, I was interested in knowing what it had been like when she was there in the 40s and early 50s. So I did a lot of investigating. I discovered that a man, Glenn Sandifer, had written a book on relating to the past lives of Jesus. And when I went to the office and the archives, I met a wonderful woman, Jeanette Thomas, the archivist. She was fabulous. And when my late mentor's colleague, Jerry, sent some samples of that work to me, she welcomed them into the archives. And that night she said she had a dream that Gladys Davis Turner, who guided her, showed her these pink jewels, and they were going into her hands, and she said to be careful that none were lost. So I had many experiences of guidance and connection with people like Jeanette Thomas, who said to help allow my mentor to rise in terms of her work. But I did see that the booklets that she had written, Lynn Cayce had put in the archives, and that others had heavily used them for other books. And I thought it's still a purpose of mine to see that she rises in terms of her own pioneering work. But I expected that maybe when I was there in my steamy kind of humid lodgings, because we had a fan but not air conditioning, and in my room, that I would sense the guidance of my mentor, Jessica. But instead it was Lynn Cayce. He was there all the way with me, and I felt that he had wanted to have had an opportunity to have reached out more to Jessica, and he was definitely there with me. I enjoyed the meditation room on the third floor. That is a sense, gives you a sense of peace and tranquility. view of the sea. I joined a study group. I met strong friends from the past. I not only attended survey lectures, but there was another fellow, Kevin. He was working in the mailroom, and he was doing a couple survey lectures, and I did survey lectures too. So I learned how to lecture according to their format, and I would deliver lectures for visitors, on meditation or dreams or reincarnation. So I was doing that. I was going to yoga. It was wonderful. They had meditation and yoga breaks. I was in the larger rooms, and it was never dull. I was always drawn to the stacks and the readings, and of course had the classes. Back in California, I had a creative writing mentor who was a Jungian, and I balked at one point because Jung, took a step from Freud, and he brought the spirituality into psychology in his studies. But he did say that we have like our inner subordinate feminine side if you're a man, an inner masculine if you're a woman. That's all fine and good. But he defined the things more according to stereotypes. And I'd always been one to question things, question and fight against racism or sexism. So then I was in California. I'd studied with Universal Church of the Master. I'd taken some ministerial training, which in our church meant being kind of a lay person in the community. And even there, the language, which was lovely in our texts, seemed to be masculine focused. So I'd already gone through this sort of crisis that, say, a man might experience if he had grown up in a world where the president, the frame of reference was entirely masculine. He might be longing, or a feminine, let's say it was led by women only, and only a feminine perspective. You come to a point where you say, I'm part of the divine. I want to connect with the divine in my own terms as a woman. So I'd already had kind of a spiritual awakening. I'd begun to study the ancient matrilineal and goddess systems of religion that existed on Earth for about 30 to 50,000 years, as documented by early archaeology. I read books like When God Was a Woman, The Chalice and the Blade, and I had even begun to do original research and share talks at my church, which really at first no one had heard of, and then kind of caught on. And when I got out there, I had that background. And so I took a class at Atlantic University from Jess Stern, who wrote The Sleeping Prophet. And he had us write a story from a man's view for several months. And it was a little sexist and ageist. He was a charming fellow. He'd never taught before, per se. And so one time this woman librarian, older than myself, from Norfolk, got up and she said, Jess, this story, it was kind of I'll just say kind of a sexist story. She questioned whether we should continue to write it. And he said, Madam, you can sit down. You are not a woman. And that was it for me. I went, I am going to do some research on the divine feminine Edgar Cayce. I'm going to see what Cayce really said. And so I did, and I had friends. They were computerizing the reading. So on Sunday, I had a friend from school who knew somebody who was doing it, and I gave a list of words to him that I knew related to the ancient feminine traditions of spirituality. I went to the marketing department, and they said, Cayce missed the boat on this. He never talked about it. And so I looked up things like, goddess or priestess or just a lot of things. And darn if there wasn't a big list. And I thought, I'm going to do my graduate work on this. And so I found real early allusions to in Cayce's work, lots of them. So then when I went back to graduate later in 91, my then husband, my daughter, we actually drove all the way back. When I got there, Reverend Bob Danner, who had been on the thesis committee, and another man who had very Christian background, I don't think is living then, very traditional, they found a reading in Cayce for me. And it said that we should always heed the mother God symbolized by Jesus and Christ, had turned to. Anyway, it was wonderful. It talked about Jesus's own connection to that, and it was wonderful. And I broke some ground, and I wrote something. I found for the first time the connections between Cayce's work and that body of scholarship about this reemerging divine feminine, and it was exciting to do. It was fraught with some challenges, and it was Charles Thomas was there. I would go in and meet with him sometimes, and I was interested. There was a man named Joe Fiutko who had worked in a very humble position for decades, who had known my mentor, and I started interviewing. While I was there, I began to interview. I interviewed Sally Cayce. I went out, and her then living son, Edgar Cayce, and daughter, they had me in on it was becoming wintry in the first term, and they baked cookies, and I sat with Sally Cayce for hours, really just interviewing her on her part or her understanding of the work. And so they have that, there was some original work that hadn't been done. Not Nell Gwynn, but I started interviewing particularly women because I decided to do an intergenerational study where I would interview women of all ages on both coasts and ask how they felt they fit in with Cayce's work. So I started that project. Dr. Gladys McGarry, whom I'd already known because I'd taken my disabled daughter to her in Arizona, was there, and I interviewed her. So it was a rich time. I came home between terms, and I studied temporarily with Father Matthew Fox, who does the Institute of Culture and Creation Spirituality in Oakland, California. He was a Catholic theologian with double or triple PhDs who did buck up against the Vatican because he was including persons from the third world. He was including multiracial, women-centered traditions. He was very exciting to study with. I studied medieval mystics, and I learned a lot about St. Clare. I relate to a lot, and Francis of Assisi, and Mechtilde of Magdeburg, and a lot of the creative Hildegard of Bingen I had a great relationship with. I learned about the rich creativity that existed in the Middle Ages, particularly of scholarly women of the church and mystics of the church, and that only enriched my graduate program. And because of me, the ARE eventually connected with Matthew Fox, and they began to have him at seminars. So he first thought the Cayce readings were a little dualistic, but he didn't know them well. Dualism means heaven is good and earth is bad. Women are temptresses. It was a kind of thinking, he explained, that in early Christianity was not like that. And we think of Judaism and the Song of Solomon that celebrates nature, that's connects nature and spirit and creator. He talked about how as the monasteries evolved, a boy might be put in the monastery when he's 7 years old and never see his mother or sister again. So there was kind of a hurt there, and they would theorize a lot of theories about women and so forth, and they weren't as holistic or as unified. So Matthew Fox unearthed the medieval mystics of the church, women and men, who had a holistic view. Hildegard of Bingen, I don't know if you know of her, but she was pre-Michelangelo and pre-Da Vinci. She was put into a convent in the Rhineland Valley of Germany as a youth, and she had a mentor named Jutta, a woman who taught her. So she became very literate at a time 900 years ago women were not. And after Jutta's death, they wanted her to run the abbess, but she was hesitant to show her knowledge and her gifts, and she became ill in her 40s. And finally the light, appeared to her and said, "Hildegard, get up, speak and write what you see and hear." So she began to compose pre-Gregorian chants. She designed these mandalas, which were sewn by the nuns and monks, that held elements of 21st century physics and Aztec symbols. And here she is in Germany. She worked with holistic health, almost doing holistic health advice and readings. She was multi-talented, and just recently became a saint. But I had that background to bring, and then I was able to make see how I could, what Cayce said. And there were rich connections in the reading. I mean, Cayce, when Rata, past life of Cayce, was exiled into Egypt long ago, there in Egypt, he met Hermes, who was a man of dark skin, Africa, a great mystic. And he brought Hermes back into Egypt, and with Isis, they shared tremendous teachings and enlightenment. But it was a time when racial prejudice and so forth was just starting, that dualism. And Hermes comforted himself with foods. He was a very big man, past life of Jesus. And he later, when Jesus went through before crucifixion, when he was tempted by Satan, whom the Zoroastrians would call Shayatin, or the shadow side, with given temptations, they came from past lives, Jessica said, and one of them was Satan would turn the rocks into bread. And that symbolizes our tendency when we have wounds and hurts and we resort to addictive things to cover up our pain. In that case, Hermes was being a little bit discriminated against as an African, so he turned to food, but he couldn't do it this time because he was, taking those final steps toward being that way for us. And so then there were ones about he could be flown from the housetops and, be the king. And Jessica felt that he had lived before as Ram of Atlantis, who had flown in to India. There are legends of him meeting Sita, she who was born in the furrow, almost a daughter of a priest, sort of a goddess symbol, and how in love they were, but that they married, but she was spirited off by a pirate. And he was so consumed with jealousy and heartache that the son she had wasn't his, in fact, was his, that whole thing of being brought in, in glory into India, he had to say no to that. And he was, and the other lifetime that she talked about really was as Joseph of the Old Testament. Very similar pattern, that Joseph sold by his brothers. Joseph, his mother had waited so long to have a child, and her husband had children with the concubines, and finally her son was born, so she was just extolling him. And the brothers became understandably jealous, and so they, dropped him off and said he'd been killed by animals. As we know, he was taken through Egypt. He rose to become a dream interpreter, and he dreamed of the 7 years of hardship and the 7 years of plenty. So Egypt was prepared, but his father's family was not, and the brothers had to come and beg for food. And Jessica thought he kind of enjoyed them bowing down, so he didn't quite reach the Christ consciousness that he did when betrayed by so many in Palestine. Anyway, I digress, but it was a rich time of putting together what I'd been taught, what I was researching, having that wonderful library, and tremendous intuitive experiences of guidance. I enjoyed walking around the old hospital, of a night, and just seeing the pictures there.
No, because the books. So you had already written that book. I forgot the name of it, but
Born in Berkeley.
Yeah, was that before? Then you wrote that, and then you went and did the Atlantic University course, or that?
Actually, I had worked on that book earlier. I had gone when I went back to San Jose State. I had the nucleus of it when I was the rebel kid in Mexico and encountered beat era icons like Ken Kesey, the anti-hero Neil Cassidy. I wrote short stories and I had the nucleus of it, but I didn't begin publishing books until after I returned. So I had been more teaching, the women's spirituality circles. I had been teaching intuitive development through my spiritualist church and so forth. And when I did the graduate thesis, that was, an important time. And I received a lot of guidance, being in a graduate program, I learned everything had to be documented. Every source had to be documented. Sometimes I'd have an insight and the committee would write back, where did that come from? And I'd tell them a dream and they would accept that, because we learned that there is a different system of measurement in transpersonal psychology, not the scientific method of weighing things in a scale or testing it with acid chemicals, but rather it was in subjective measures. We learned a lot. We read many articles on transpersonal studies, and I learned a lot about the field of transpersonal psychology, which is the psychology that connects us to our higher selves, to the collective consciousness, to the realms that Cayce talked about. They kind of made sure we had a broader education outside of just Cayce, but all of the research materials were there, in which informal studies were, it was rich surrounding us. So I came back, I studied with Matthew Fox, and I went back for another term and studied again and returned in 90. And then I came back and worked on my graduate thesis at a distance. And then finally in summer of 91, we drove out and I participated in the graduation ceremonies. And so far I've found the pictures of that time. I'm looking for pictures of earlier times in the studies, but I've sent those to you. What we want to say, after writing that book, and well, I'm going to add this, when I returned from my studies, I was respected, I think, because in the circles of people studying metaphysical topics, you have a graduate degree from the Cayce, Institute. They were still working on full accreditation, which they have, and I'm under that umbrella. And I lectured at a well-known East-West bookstore, San Jose Bookshop, New Age Renaissance fairs for the Universal Church of the Master, for Solar Cross. I started doing a lot of more structured Cayce lectures using the tools that I had been taught by doing the survey lectures, and through the more scholarly path I'd taken. So it was a very, I did that in the early 90s. I returned to teaching for the YWCA, and then I went on to teach through the Metropolitan Adult Education System. I became a teacher of creative writing, and I still do that, through Zoom. I help other people write books and novels.
Nice.
In the meantime, through all of this, I have a special needs daughter, and my late husband, Joseph Haddox, came into my life, her wonderful stepfather, in in the 80s, and we had been part of groups of other parents and families trying to help create community group homes. When I studied with Matthew Fox, I was able to bring him to San Jose State University, introduce him on stage. There were lectures that helped support starting a group home, and stuff. So I was involved with that too.
So what about your artwork? Because I see you got a lot of art. Did you do that as well while your creative art side?
Well, when I was a teenager and I was in those sort of counterculture movements, I always had a sketch pad. An older girl had introduced me to sketching people. And there was sort of a hippie type house. It was right near the police station, ironically, a Victorian house. And people would stay there, including the anti-hero Neil Cassidy, whom Jack Kerouac wrote about. And so she had a pad there, and I was, whoa, look at you. You fix your own car and you do all these things. And she would call young guys that lived in the building to be our models, which was unheard of. Women have never through the centuries had male models, much less they were blocked from other models. So I learned to sketch people and I learned to draw. And for a while I did that a lot. When I had my special needs daughter, I put it aside a lot and occasionally did that, a little bit of poetry and color when I was in the spiritual search group. But when I returned from my graduate studies, but it was even earlier in the 80s, my younger daughter said, "Mom, you're so good. You should take some classes." So I started taking community classes. I love the adult education system because older people are so generous and they would share their knowledge. So I started, and when I came back, I had worked on, I worked on the graduate thesis, I'm trying to think of the order of these. I worked on the graduate thesis, of course, that was 91. And I also had a novel I had written in the early 80s called The Rainbow's Daughter, based on the experience of being in the Young People's Spiritual Search Group, meeting Jessica, learning about Edgar Cayce. And so that one was a novel, but my publication of those didn't happen after my graduate program, later, and would stretch on through, especially early at the millennium. I published a lot of those books when Joe was living. It was a great loss when he passed in 2008, because he was such a wise old soul. When he came back for the graduation, we did some investigating. Jessica had come to my home to give readings after I left the young people's group, and she was lecturing from LA through Seeker's Quest at De Anza College. She would stay at my house and do very deep Cayce-oriented readings. She had never asked money for the readings, but we all insisted. She was older now and she needed it. And so she would do these readings and I would listen while she did real Akashic readings. So after she died, I became more able to do that because of her influence and perhaps in spirit. So where was I? And she had always encouraged writing, but I had left the young people's group and I had written, with Joe's help. He plugged me onto an early computer, and I'm not a computer person, but he helped me. So I had a lot of writings, but it was after I returned, I wrote the graduate thesis first. And then, gradually assembled those books and gradually got them into print. And hope, my small publisher has passed away, and I'm wanting and hoping for their circulation now in a new way. Going back to art, so I did.
The art, yeah.
Yeah, the art. So I had gotten back into art, and I illustrated the first book. So I would do sketches, of Jessica as an older person, of the leader of the first group. I did a lot of sketches that enriched those books. As I built the books up, I was doing illustrating type sketching, and then later got re-immersed more in acrylic painting, especially as closer to the time that Joe passed. And during the pandemic, my woman friend Ann Schiffman, now called Jessica Schiffman, is a prominent artist in Southern California, and she gifted me with the online workshops. It was fun to re-immerse in art. The singing started after my husband passed. I had sung a little in the choir of that Family of Man early group. But I have a deeper voice. I mean, and so I thought I couldn't sing because I'm not a soprano at all. But after Joe died, I went to a support group, for people who had lost partners and so forth. And there was a country singer fellow there, Bobby Gray. He was out of the Deep South, and he had once sung to crowds of thousands. And I thought, boy, I'd like once to sing harmony with a country singer. So I thought of, where can I go to do that? And prior to this, as I began to publish early books like Born in Berkeley and so forth, through my writing class indirectly, I was led to meet Robert Burrell, who had been a filmmaker, also grew up in Menlo Park. And he'd written a book on the town of Milpitas for Arcadia. And so I wrote a book with him on our lost shipping port in the South Bay. And I remembered Alviso, and I remembered now in 2009 when Joe died and I met the country singer, I thought, don't they have music at that historic restaurant? So I went, and rather than having him have to have me, the amateur, singing wrong notes with him, this wonderful pianist, Anita, started giving me songs in my own range, and I started having fun, probably bringing out my grandfather when I was little, who had sung some vaudeville and written for vaudeville. So I started doing that for fun. So I guess, like Hildegard, I do seem to be most propelled by a creative impulse through my life, and it expresses itself in different ways. Okay, just maybe let's do some relaxed questions.
Relax. Yeah, so you're not involved with the Cayce work anymore now, eh? Not.
Oh, I am.
You still okay.
Well, sure. A couple of years ago, I reached out because I have so much early material that I hope to place in the archives to to Jessica Newell. And I made a positive connection with her. And I started during the pandemic to send some of the materials. There was a period of time when my husband was living that we were part of the ARE Northern California kind of leadership team. And I have brought my books, even over the years, to the local conferences and so forth. And recently, my younger daughter, Megan, who wrote under the pen name of Meg Rogers, has encouraged me that we should go this fall to back to Asilomar and reconnect. So Jessica searched for the work that Hugh Lynn had preserved of Jessica, and that I had worked hard to get there. And she found the file, but not the work. And it was, kind of as made me a little heartsick, but I know that she did accept some new work, and I have to continue with that path. And I do look forward to connecting. We were looking for a conference this summer, but they weren't having it. So looking forward to renewing those connections. But I give talks on Edgar Cayce monthly. I'm giving talks at the Living in Light Independent Spiritualist Church, and I always talk about the work of Edgar Cayce. So I incorporate it in my teaching. I feel involved in it. As far as the ARE, we look forward to reconnecting with them.
There's another thing is you still have a lot of the Edgar Cayce resource material that you could.
I have so much. I'm sitting in a cabinet.
Because I think they're so valuable now because they're very hard to find, the tapes and
Well, I really want to talk about you, because you reached out to me having seen a video about my Atlantic University graduation, and then you were so kind as to allow me to send you the shorter talk that Jessica delivered for Hugh Lynn Cayce when she was organizing the early ARE in the particularly Southern California West Coast, and then the beginnings of her Past Lives of Jesus of Mary books. And I look forward to continuing that process with you when you're back to doing it. Your channel seems to go back to the real essence that I discovered when I was there interviewing the early people. There is something about it that I can't put into words that it had, and Jessica had it. It's something, I don't know what distinguishes it, but it's so valuable and so valuable. So so the improved transformed channel, I think, is an incredible resource for people who want to know what the essence of the Cayce work really is, and to hear it in its best form. So art, music. Now I teach people to write novels and capture their memoir. I think that creativity is life-giving, and I've been excited to meet a lot of older singers who showed me what life can be like ahead, who stay utterly alive through, in their case, they sing. Many of them, when we would finish a singing session at Val's Restaurant at 10, the oldest people, they were out till 2. I remember one woman who said she was in her 80s, several did, but it turned out that her life ended in this way. She had a boyfriend, I think he was in his 70s, and they would always go clubbing after she had sung at Val's. So one rainy night, they went clubbing. She slipped. She had a little something with her hip. She was in the hospital briefly. She returned to her connection with Christ that she'd always had, and she passed over. And she was Italian American, feisty. You didn't want to shake her boyfriend's hand too long. But she was singing and dancing. It turned out she was 98 that night. And so, and then I had friends like Ernie Cassetta and others who reminded me of my grandfather. They were not marginalized. They were not the concept of someone in a rocking chair. They were rocking, but their songs had so much more depth because they had lived so much longer. When they sang those early American songbook songs that I discovered there, it had universal truth and meaning. So I enjoyed that. And creativity and art, I tend to be, because of my mother's openness, I tend to act spontaneously and use, because of my graduate work and Jessica's teaching and Marcia Hunter with the early group, I listen to intuition. If I feel like grabbing the purple paint or, throwing jewelry into a mosaic, I listen to that. So I would say that the arts are really an important part of my life now, and as they have been. But the Cayce work, the principles, have never left me, and I will be talking on Sunday briefly, augmenting on reincarnation and singing a song that is based on the Cayce work and about the influence of reincarnation karma in our lives. So I'm not gone from it. I'm just in the community a lot with it. In 2023, somebody in America nominated me for Who's Who of America. And it's a tradition of honoring outstanding Americans of achievement. My focus has been not on the monetary side of it at all, but I was recognized as author, artist, and advocate. I was very excited about that. So I spent many months trying to document all my work. And I am on Marquis Who's Who of America.
So what's your plan for today?
I have my special needs daughter with me. I went to pick her up at her group home. She's in a wheelchair with a very sweet caretaker. I got some hours from Kaiser, and they're outside, and the group home doesn't have her standing or walking, but I do that. We stand up and sit down so she doesn't lose that ability. And so she'll be here, and I'll probably be she makes art too, probably doing some creative things around here. My own creative work to let it, be out in the world more. Almost every novel I wrote ultimately relates, even if it's edgy characters other than Born in Berkeley. Most of them have references.
Are they in Kindle format as well?
They are. They're in
Kindle.
Kindle.
Well, that's
right
good
now.
because Kindle. Because
my publisher had a stroke, and I have to. There's a guy in Los Angeles. Oh, I should say that. I'm gonna add one more thing. Let me just talk about where what I'll do. I'll get in touch with Daniel, and I'll give you a link.
Okay.
He just republished Born in Berkeley, and he is a valid publisher in Los Angeles. And I'm trying to get the works are kind of in dormant because the small publisher passed away. But Daniel Yarian, I started doing literary events too. I co-led them in the Bay Area. I could add that if you want. I led with him literary events at the Beat Museum and around the Bay Area, and he's doing that in Los Angeles. And because when I was on the road as a kid, I met these famous people. Therefore, I have this connection to that famous period, and that sort of starts. And then my character. Now, you asked me, Keith, about my books, and let me talk about them. There's a Born in Berkeley series, and it starts out in the mid to late 60s, where a teenager young woman is, by life circumstances and by her own curiosity, kind of ends up on the road and immersed in those pivotal and edgy experiences. One of them in my life led me when I was supposed to go to a girls' school in Mexico, and ran into a young man who was studying to be a doctor, influenced me to go to the University of Mexico. And then later I traveled with some young students to the West Coast, and we ran into accidentally the enclave of Ken Kesey, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and the man late in his life now, Neil Cassidy, who was kind of an anti-hero, and he was written about by Kerouac. So later I was able to write those experiences, not from the point of view of, I was not a groupie, and I was just a young person coming of age who really experienced all of this. So I wrote kind of a poetic, edgy novel called Born in Berkeley that's set then. Then I wrote The Rainbow's Daughter, which is the one about encountering in the 70s this charismatic leader who ultimately led me to Jessica, the woman of wisdom, and what it was like to become involved with one of those typical spiritual search groups that had good and bad, in the 70s, The Color the psychic experiences. And so I wrote The Rainbow's Daughter. Then when I went back east, of course, I worked on the graduate thesis. I also wrote a novel called Shadow Over the Beach, which gets into all the different aspects of it's written as a novel, and it has steamy portions of a young woman back in that, having that experience. And then I wrote two books that sort of anticipate. Now we read about transgender, but when I was at a Cayce conference back there, I'd met a man named Robert Hausman and his lady friend Diane, and he was a good artist. When I returned from school, we couples became friends, and we did some art and past life research together. He also was a cross-dresser. I'd never heard about it, so I wrote a couple of novels where, my character gets into that epic and exploring, the trans things. And so it was kind of a predecessor. And if you take intuitive power and misuse it, so it's called Revenge of the Goddess and Parting the Veil. The second book occurred when he became ill of a form of leukemia, and it had to bring him back, and myself too, to the spiritual side of life. And then I wrote a 4-part novel series. One is unpublished, a quartet beginning with A Burst of Sunrise, and it was about people I would see that meeting at middle age who might be soulmates but not totally free to be together, and what happens then? It could be kind of a mess. But I wrote a quartet of novels, one unpublished, and then I wrote a mystery, completely fiction, called A Valley of Ashes. When I started teaching creative writing, I ran into another writer from the South named Thomas Hurst, who's passed away now, who was instrumental when I began my creative writing teaching. And I could feel that he had a recent past life, and I was very much led to it. He closely resembled the novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald. From him, I learned a little bit more about writing short stories, and I made a fictional book about all that, a quartet. So then I also, after writing all those partially autobiographical books, or very much so in the case of The Rainbow's Daughter, I wanted to write real fiction, and Tom was good at it. I could not grasp it. And so I took one of his short stories called Magnolias, about a little boy in the South who's homeless, walking past the home of a girl with a magnolia tree who gives him food. And so I thought, I'm going to write this story, but set it in Menlo Park. So I put it in Flood Park near where I lived. And he had difficulties, and I had a bit of challenges with my mother at the time. So I wrote it sentence by sentence. I tried to follow his pace, and I kind of caught on. And then I have an unpublished book of short stories yet. And so then, having done all this, I wrote a manuscript called A Valley of Ashes. And I want to say that the manuscript wrote itself. I was originally, when I'd left my writing teacher's house after leaving the Family of Man group back in, we're looking at the early 80s. She had asked me at her little table at her house, Louise Vernon, she said, well, tell me about that experience, because I told her I was in that group. And I said this and that. And then I said, and I was with them 7 years. And then one day I walked out and never came back. And she said, write that down. So I wrote that novel about being in that group and having to detach also. And the Jessica character is sort of off stage. She's in Los Angeles, but she becomes really the conscience of the girl and the beckoning figure with Cayce. So I wrote that book. So now later, this is later, and I think we're looking at the late 90s, maybe after 2000. I was in a car, and all of a sudden I could see a woman. I felt this woman, and she's my fictional character. She's sitting in a diner outside Stockton, California, and she's got a disabled sister she went to visit. Her mother had passed. Her partner has passed away from cancer or something, and her teenage rebel daughter is gone. And she was the white farm working child growing up. And I know a woman like it, but in a way she was unlike anyone I knew. And I was her. She's in this diner. She has no food. And so she remembers her mother telling her, if you ain't got nothing and nothing to eat, go to a diner and put ketchup in the water and eat the crackers and you will have food. So she does this, and the water looks like it's almost streaked with blood and so forth. And then her mother is a character too, who comes through, and she's trying to give love to her daughter, because when she lived, she was so occupied with the handicapped daughter, I know about that she neglected the other one. And then all of a sudden, I feel a man at a golf course somewhere in San Jose, and he's shooting balls, but it's kind of a crummy golf course, and the water looks almost like it could be a nuclear pond. And we learn his background, that he came out here for a new beginning. He lost his job in a dot-com crash, and has problems with alcohol and women. So we learn about him. And then there's this kid who, outside Stockton, has been thrown out of his house for wearing goth girlish clothes. And his father has struck him. And I'm in the mind of these four people. And I'll tell you, Keith, after that, I didn't really write it. The words, I hear words kind of in my head, and it just started writing itself. So I wrote this mystery called The Valley of Ashes, in which the woman doesn't have a way back to San Jose, so she picks up the teenager and feels sorry for him for gas. And later, she works in a Catholic church. She can't hide him there, loses her job, and she goes to what I based on the GE warehouse in San Jose, an old warehouse and workplace. And they hide in these old trailers. And it's Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish holy days. And I have a leasing manager, Mort Mathline, who's about to have a transpersonal either breakdown or breakthrough. And it turns into a mystery. And so I wrote that. And then I wrote, somewhere in there, I wrote a book based on my graduate work, of course. And then in later years, in 2016, I wrote a book about the older people in the singing called The Last Piano Bar. And I took my character, who started and born in Berkeley, and she's morphed through all the books, and she kind of resolves at the last piano bar. So I have a lot of books. I've been painting more. I've been singing more. And that's me. Creativity is life-giving, but the Cayce work has been my lodestar. It's been my heart. The principles of Cayce are always with me at all times. And I know he said there are a lot of metaphysical groups that have big mental systems, but Cayce said you find it in the smile of a babe, in the scent of the rose, and it's trying every day just to do the best that we can, living up to the pattern set by Christ and all the wonderful, I know, the Essenes and those that surrounded him, and trying to live that every day. So today would be a day, if I can share a smile with the caretaker of my daughter, if I can lift my child's spirits, if we can find some joy today, that's really my purpose today, is to be a channel of blessings to others. Right. Thank you.
No, that was good.
Be a good ending.
Yeah, that was good. So I'll put.
That's what it's really about. It's really like every day, to try. So I appreciate you doing this. It's a chance. Legacy is really important to me right now, getting things that they're not lost. And I really appreciate this. It was a good day for it. And I'm open to any topics you want to explore further.
Yep. We'll hopefully connect again, and
yeah.
Maybe I'll email you some ideas, and then
we could have a short session on a topic or something. I'd love it. And I'll start trying to send more pictures. And, if any of the songs are fun and you could put one up. The fellow I ran into at church, he's such a giving person. It's not for money, but it's really joyful, And I sent you a playlist with the songs.
I listened to all
find
of them.
one you like, and it could go up from your channel. He would love it. And I sent the one on civil rights to Professor Henry Louis Gates, who does, you know him from Harvard, and he does the Finding Your Roots program for mostly Black people, but others as well. He's well known on public television here. And he listened to it. He says, "This is a treasure. I was thrilled to get it." So, it's a time of outreach. Of course, we have a new political opportunity, which I personally am excited about. And so anyway, it's all cool. And if one of them that you like, could play, it's just what place people could enjoy that joy. I know you were playing a couple of country tunes on there, and I thought it was cool. So thank you. And I hope right now you're not doing new videos. You're working on your training.
Yeah, that's
oh,
why.
there comes let me introduce you to my daughter here. I want you to meet her. Okay. Hi there, Nanita. This is my friend Keith from South Australia.
Hello.
We just did the interview. Say hi, Vanessa.
Hi.
Say hi.
Hi.
Nanita's helping me.
Yeah.
Hi, Vanessa. Can you say
Hi.
hi to Keith?
Hi, Dave.
Keith, what did you do today? Tell
And
me.
Jimmy.
You want to go swimming.
Mm.
What things do you like, Vanessa?
And Jean. And Jean.
Going on the train. What else?
Swimming.
Miss Piggy?
Miss Piggy.
And so can you show me how you can walk your own chair a little bit?
Yeah.
Try to pull it yourself. Oh, Vanessa, can you do it? You're kicking your legs. I love it. I love it. Okay, say bye, Keith.
Have a cake. Have a cake.
Okay, that's my life here. Okay.
Okay.
Talk to you soon, Keith. It was
Yeah.
great.
Yep. I'll send
Bye-bye.
you. Okay. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Right.
I hear the bells of St. Clair
ringing through past life mist.
I hear the bells of St. Francis.
It was there that I was kissed.
The long ago is here now.
I can clearly see back.
My time with you was blessed.
In memory I will never lack.
You too can find your lifetimes
Hidden in the mists.
Where and why you live them,
Your purpose and your gist. Earthly lives are our schoolroom, heaven our final goal. Karma is made by omission, not doing what we know.
I hear the London Tower door
Slam on my trumped up crimes
in the 16th century royal jail.
in that hapless life of mine. I hear my father speak for the poor
In Dickens' difficult time,
when father dies. I take my life too. Should have stayed and made him shine.
I hear the sound of movie cameras
Worrying on a 30s set, acting and happy till illness comes. Cut short by karmic debt.
The long ago is here now.
I can clearly see back. My time with you was blessed. In memory I will never lack.
You too can find your lifetimes
Hidden in the mists.
where and why you live them,
Your purpose and your gist. Forgiving love sets us free. Heaven's grace is here and now. Past lives reveal our destiny. Blessings eternally.
The